Hello and welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for choosing to spend this next hour with us. For those of you who haven't had the pleasure of meeting yet, my name's Lou, my pronouns are she, her, and I am one of the people and development consultants here at Atkinson HR. And I am incredibly excited to be hosting this panel on culture by design today. And I've got some wonderful panelists joining me this afternoon. So, what we're going to do is, in a moment, I'll ask each of them to do a quick round of introductions. But before that, just some of the general housekeeping. We have a Q&A option today. So if you have any questions for our panelists, please do feel free to pop them in there and I'll keep an eye out on those and field as many questions as we can. And if anybody has any comments, the chat function is also open. But otherwise, I will start to hand over to my wonderful panelists and we'll get started because you're here to see them, right? So we'll get started. Andy, can you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, thanks, Lou. I'm Andy Winter. I am currently the Interim Director of Student Life at the University of Kent. For those of you who've not met me before but might have looked me up on LinkedIn, you'll see I spent the first 15 years of my career in student unions, starting off as a student officer, working alongside Graham Atkinson when he was a student officer. And then I worked every level of student union up to the senior management team, finally ending as director of membership services at the University of Nottingham Students' Union. I then crossed the car park, went to the dark side, hunter turned gamekeeper, joined the university side of administration, working in the registrar's department as a title that was Campus Life Director, which was essentially a student support director. Worked for 4.5 years at the University of Nottingham in that role, all through the pandemic. So that was a lovely fun time. And then moved up to the University of Sheffield, where I was Director of Student Support Services for 3 years. Left Sheffield 2 summers ago, and have since done a couple of interim contracts. So worked for 7.5 months at Goldsmiths, University of London, and have now been working at Kent for around close to a year.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Andy. Next, I'd like to introduce you to Amrit.
Hello, everyone. So I'm Amrit, and I'm the Director of People and Culture at Leeds University Union. So yeah, most of you will be familiar with that. We're supporting around 40,000 students, just over 400 staff across the usual range of functions, from commercial venues and events, all the way through to student advocacy. And Andy was just telling me that he worked here before. My background is not union based, so it's a bit of a patchwork history, which I think is part of why culture does fascinate me. I started out in food and hospitality, including time at Pret a Manger, where I worked, right the way through up to managing stores. And then I moved into the third sector, working in mental health and well-being with minoritized communities, particularly the elderly. And that was a really interesting time. And before joining LUU, I spent time at the largest single equal pay worker-owned cooperative in Europe. So again, around 400 staff across all types of functions, but it was shared democratic accountability in a business and shared ownership, which influenced really how people related to the values and principles there. So yeah, and that's all led to my journey being here as Director of People Culture at Leeds University Union.
Amazing. Thank you, Amrit. And last but not least, we have Sam Harris.
Hello. Hello everyone, I'm Sam Harris. My pronouns are she, her. I have been Deputy CEO of a large membership organisation, and I'm currently an organisational development consultant working in culture, compassionate change, interim leadership and EDI. And I have the massive pleasure of being interim CEO of Sunderland Students' Union at the moment, whilst the real CEO, as I call her, is on maternity leave. So yeah, that's me.
Fantastic, thank you. And so we'll get started with our first question, if everybody is happy to jump in. So my first question for you, whilst people are kind of thinking of their own to pop into the Q&A section, is in your experiences, what's been the impact of intentionally developed values-led culture? So just giving people a moment to have a think. Does anyone want to jump in first?
I'll start.
Go on, Sam.
Yeah, I was waiting for you to start, Andy, so that's nice. Two ways that jump to mind immediately. It's recruitment and retention, right? So that's the way you would hope that people want to be attracted to your organisation in recruitment, and it sort of acts as the way I see it is it acts as a filter in both directions, and you're testing that person's values fit and they're testing your values fit. And I suppose it saves a lot of time if you are recruiting in a values lens to make sure that down the line, when you get to your retention point, people are staying and they feel aligned to it. And I think, we've all done exit interviews where people have said, oh, it just doesn't, the culture doesn't fit, or it doesn't align with what I want. And so trying to expend as much time as possible in the recruitment bit to save you that sort of fatigue down the line of having to keep thinking about what that looks like for your culture, especially when people don't align with it, I think is a great way to invest. I'm not going to take all the answers because Andy and Anne will want some, won't they?
Do you want to go on next, Anne?
No, you be my guest.
Oh, okay.
I'll chip in at the end on this one.
Okay, so I mean, from my perspective, the example I was going to actually give was the one that I'm currently undertaking, which was I was brought into Kent in June last year, initially on a 7-month contract with a very specific remit, which was to complete a restructuring process that was going to bring together 26 teams that had previously been part of 6 different professional services departments. And even though I was only an interim member of staff, I was really clear with the chief operating officer, who's my boss, that a key part of the job was going to be establishing a new culture for this new directorate. Because if I didn't, then the remnants of all of the pre-existing cultures would remain, and then whoever came in to do the job permanently would just have another job of trying to unpick this and start again. So I started in a really difficult environment in that our area wasn't the only professional services area that was being restructured. The whole of the institution's professional services was being restructured. I mean, people know anything about what's been going on at Kent in the last few years. It's been a really quite unstable backdrop. University strategies in a state of flux. So there's no real kind of North Star that people in the directorate could orient around, and we didn't know it at the time when we started doing the work, but in the background, and that emerged just after we completed the restructure, there was an announcement about a potential merger with the University of Greenwich. So it was a really quite febrile environment that we were working in, and with that in mind, I looked at what was going on within the institution and went, what do I think are the key values that we need to put in place for this new culture? And I, landed on, openness and transparency, continuous improvement, outward focus, compassion and empathy and collaboration. And I never formally published these. They're not written down. If you come here, you won't see them on a wall or in a planning document. But I've stated them publicly and privately within my management team meetings and my wider staff meetings that I do both publicly and privately. And I've looked to live them in each of activities that I've done. And looking at the question that we had about the impact, I think it really helped in terms of playing through this really tense process, because I was really able to demonstrate and embed quite quickly these principles when we were talking about what were intentionally quite challenging conversations for people. They'd been in this position of distress for quite some time about what was the structure going to look like, would I have a job, and being able to to start with a lot of transparency, a lot of openness, a lot of honesty about where we were. I think that really helped. I started by being able to say what we might be able to change, what we wouldn't be able to change, and why. And that really helped people, because they then got to see through the process, well, these are the things that we could change and these were the things that couldn't be changed. And it really felt like people were saying, oh, well, actually, you lived that promise. You didn't do what I expected to happen in a consultation, which was you would go, yes, give me your comments, and then you would just totally ignore them and do what you were going to do anyway. I do think, though, I was really helped by the fact that my personal values and the organization that I was coming into were a really good fit, and it links to what Sam was saying before. I was listening to there's a football podcast, Guardian Football Weekly podcast, was talking recently about Mo Salah bringing his career at Liverpool to an end, and the football writer Jonathan Wilson said this brilliant thing, which was it shows how significant circumstance an environment can be. You can be a 90 out of 100 player, but you can look like a 70 out of 100 player if you're not in the right place, and you can look like a 99 out of 100 player if you are in the right place. And I'm not saying I'm Mo Salah. I'm not the Mo Salah of the student academic services world. I very much see myself more as a Gini Wijnaldum, kind of, flexible all-rounder, connecting the team, moving the ball, occasional flashes of brilliant. I've already lost the people here who are on the panel with me. They're like, stop talking football. But it's a thing about cultural fit. And I think that thing of understanding the organization that you're working with and fitting that culture, we'll probably talk about this a bit later, about how you then try and impose things on a culture and how far you can move things. But that made an incredible difference because I had the ability to mold and was coming into an environment where I could land really well and not immediately challenge what were kind of pre-existing kind of cultural difficulties.
You've got a friend in the football world, Andy, I suppose. I'd have to try and limit my football analogies at work because, I know who Mo Salah is, but I'm a women's football fan, really. So, forgive me if I use Chelsea analogies here, but I'll try and limit them. I mean, there's not much to add to what Sam and Andy have just said there, really. But again, I think it's showing, where I've seen them really land are the ones where they show up at every touch point and not in a performative way, not just in an induction or on a wall, although that, certainly helps. But I think where I saw it work incredibly well is where, like Sam said, where they're present right the way from when you saw job adverts, knew what to expect, but also through your training, and through how performance is observed. And also in our world, it's not necessarily rewarded, but I've worked in places where, behavior and kind of how you shape customer service, for example, was incentivized, and values and behaviors kind of shaped that. I think the learning for somewhere like where I am now, it's the mechanism, I suppose, that as much as the message. So it's how you deliver it. And at LUU now, I think certainly, it feels weird to still be saying post-pandemic, but we are still changing things and a lot of organizations are still in flux. And I think having a North Star really helps staff and leaders alike, really, to kind of orient yourselves at a time that does feel volatile and it does feel full of change, and society and the world can feel really challenging, particularly for a younger workforce that's experiencing things that, we keep saying unprecedented, but that is effectively it. So I think the thing that I suppose I always come back to is that in a complex world, you need to provide simplicity, because that lands for people where they can build routine and they can understand what's expected of them. And so, we're actively building some of those mechanisms now, where I think previously you could assume that people understood what you meant. I think people want more clarity these days as to how that's lived and how they can be expected to show up at work, and what they can also expect in return. So with one of your colleagues, Lou, actually, we're building a behaviour framework at the moment, and the benefit, I suppose, again, I've been in places where that's already been implemented from a leadership perspective, but the approach that we're taking here is that our last staff conference, where we invite all of our staff to attend, we gathered feedback about what they would want from a workplace in terms of the behaviours that they would want to see from their team members, from leaders, from managers, and how they would want to be held accountable themselves to that, and what shapes a good working environment from them. So we're attempting to build it bottom up effectively, and take that feedback to something we've recently shaped as the Performance and Culture Working Group, which takes people from around the business, and then shaping those behaviours, because it's how you live them, isn't it? And if you can refer to that, then you can reference that in when you're having your development conversations, and you can reference it, okay, if you want to step up from here to here, then what's required of you to be able to do that. And I suppose it gives people a lived language, I suppose, rather than something that's just written or invented by leadership, which I think more and more is less common these days. But I think it takes time, and it takes consistency, and yeah, there are, I'd say, yeah, a lot of places are in flux. We certainly are at the moment, so we're very much building that from the ground up, even though I think we still do attract people, like Andy said, that naturally resonate with who we are and how we work. So that is a wonderful benefit of having the reputation. But yeah, I'd again, just providing that clarity for people on what we are and how we live it is crucial going forward.
Thank you, everyone. You might have seen me kind of like dip my head down and taking some notes. It's really insightful, and I love that, a couple of you have said like values being your North Star. I love the co-created aspect of values. And Andy, you were insightful in sharing that, you didn't publish them, and you certainly didn't have them kind of painted on your wall. That these are kind of lived day-to-day experiences. And you've touched on some of these already, but how for our wider audience who might be going through lots of change or experiencing some kind of cultural difficulties, how do you transition values from those painted on your wall or in your strategy into that day-to-day lived experience for colleagues?
Sorry,
Go on, Sam.
Yeah, I've had a recent experience of this actually. We are working on a new strategy at Sunderland, and it's interesting because we're working on it. Both CEOs are working on it while she's on that leave, and then we're in that sort of stage where when she comes back, it's going to be approved. And one of the things we looked at quite early on was the values that we are going to put in place. And we had a similar experience last week where we brought all the staff together and talked about values, behaviours, and trying to build that with them, so that we can launch it at the same time. And I was thinking, one of the things that I am constantly thinking about, and I think you can either do this really naturally or you have to work on it. And I don't think that means you're a bad leader. I think it's just something you have to have in the back of your mind, is if you're not doing this and you're not modelling it, then who is? And we had some live issues come up last week that I had to think, right, on Thursday we're going to talk about these new values, and this is happening on Tuesday and Wednesday. What behaviour should I exhibit now, so that when that lands on Thursday, they can draw on live examples throughout the week of what's happening. And I think that you can there are a number of ways you can do this, and I could talk about this all day, but thinking about how your expectations of people in the organisation has to be the same expectations of yourself. So you have to be able to have a conversation where you're going, right, I'm going to push back on this. This feels icky to me because it's chiming with this value. Like I can't figure out why, but this is what I'm getting from it. And if you're also not working every day to embed the values that you have in your organisation, or even within your team or in your management team or whatever, then it's just not going to land. It is just going to be the poster. And with that, I suppose you have to work alongside that of, you can be a values-based leader and push your values in every day, but also expect high performance. And like, what does that look like for you? Like, it's not it's not a failure to expect high standards from your team, high performance from your team, and also challenge that when that's happening. You just have to frame that within your values. So I think all of those things, but it absolutely starts with the leader that is supposed to be exhibiting this and pushing it within the team.
Yeah, I'll just follow on from that about, I think, if you can see examples of it happening, that's the kind of best way of doing this. I mentioned earlier on, that I'd said, continuous improvement, collaboration. Those were things that I really wanted to get out of the team. I had a situation recently where a colleague from our retention and engagement support team had spotted a weakness with a process that runs across a few different teams in our organisation. So different pillars as well, so different line management leadership structures. And what they did, they didn't just flag it, they actually connected with the people in that other team, went, I've spotted this, I think we can fix it this way, what do you think? So basically brought them together and they just fixed it. And it would have gone under the radar if it hadn't been for the fact that I happened to be in a chat chain that they were on while they were doing it. And I spotted it and went, I'm going to pull that out, and kind of pulled it out and said thank you to them individually. And then our next all staff went, and they've just done this brilliant thing to kind of go, look, real demonstration of the values in action so that people can see it. I'm sure there'll be other stuff that won't have gone on that's a bit hidden beneath the radar, but being able to highlight and escalate that when people are living those values and show it to other people as well, I think is really important. I do think there's something about the values you choose as well, because one of the things that I've seen over time is, I suppose, the difference between behavioral values and more kind of organization or mission-based values. I always had a real problem, and this is going to sound like sacrilege to colleagues and students unions, but I've never believed that democracy can be an organizational value, because it's something which, yes, of course, is crucial to our organizations and what we do, but it's something that when you say, well, how do you live that every single day within the organization? For some staff, it's just fundamentally impossible to do. It's like, all right, we're going to do all of our recruitment now through voting. Every decision we're going to make about how we clean the toilets, is that going to be done through a democratic process? And it's like, so for certain members of staff, the only way they can really demonstrate their commitment to that value is by putting on a t-shirt during election time. And you're like, that feels like it's really disconnected from the day-to-day lived experience of people. As I say, I know why people would do it, because they'd say it's not a behavioral value, it's more to do with our mission and purpose. But I think if you want that lived day-to-day experience, it has to be something that someone can grip no matter what their role is, whether they're the chief exec, whether they're the bar manager, whether they're just a shop assistant, whatever it is, they have to be able to demonstrate doing it. And that's why I think behavior-based values are just much easier for people to grip onto.
Yeah, I really sort of that bit that you said about I think expecting it in it's really challenging for leaders, I'd say, like in the current context. I think to weave that, when you talk about democracy, how do you live that? How does every single decision become democratic? And I think the nature of who we are means that that's what's expected, and I think being able to set those expectations is really important. I think probably obviously people expect values to feel kind and compassionate, and they should. We're known for that, and we lead from the front where that is concerned. But again, just coming back to what Sam said, I think where it gets a little bit sticky is that expectation that values don't also come with honest expectation. And I think being able to hold those two, there's those in both hands, and be able to walk the talk, and that live the tension between sort of the radical candidate caring personally, challenging directly. And I think it's not an easy thing to do, but I think given the nature of who we are, it's really important that we get leaders and managers really well versed in being warm and honest at the same time, so that we're being clear with people. And I think people, when you get it right, I think that resonates with staff teams, because they do want honesty, and they do want, nobody wants anybody to sort of fudge the truth, as it were. But it's not an easy thing to get right. And I think recognizing the pressure that managers are under, managing such a range of diverse needs as we've ever had in the workplace, is the real leverage for us, and supporting them is that first line of proactively, you know, being able to live behaviour-led values, as Andy said. And yeah, that's always a work in progress. I think one of the things that's, I suppose, the challenges that managers are facing is that the way, when you're talking about, okay, what are the challenges of being able to do that? And I think how people work has made that harder in recent times. Like what used to be shared spaces, informal, like cultural glue, I suppose, that we do have a lot of in unions, because we are experiential, and you know, we've got the Celebrate Week going on here at Leeds this week and next. But just being around when decisions are getting made as well, like if you're working from home and those kinds of things, or you're working flexibly, a lot of that's gone for some people. So you really got to be more deliberate in a way in how you shape it around things that just used to happen by accident, I think. And you'd hope that by now, after COVID, we've got used to that. But I think we are still in a period of understanding the impact that all has had on our staff. And then, yeah, just being able to give people real examples, and being intentional about how we bring people together helps you shape the values and the culture.
Amazing, thank you. And Amrit, you kind of touched on my next question. You know, we've got some colleagues here that are not within student unions. You've got some members of our audience who will kind of work on different locations, satellite kind of campuses or locations. And so there is that kind of mixture of different ways of working. So things like hybrid, you also have things like student staff, for those of you who are in student unions, volunteers, for other members of our audience. And so how would you kind of suggest to our audience of how to maintain a coherent culture when people are working at, you know, not just different locations, but also, you know, with flexible working, growing in our sector where people are working on different timescales and schedules and things like that? What are some of the practical things that we can do?
I think, yeah, I don't really have any sort of straightforward. I don't have all the answers.
You don't need straightforward.
Yeah, yeah. So bear with me, I suppose. I'd be interested to hear what you know people's experiences are of building this, because I think we're all learning as well. You know, not coming in with all the answers, but I suppose, I mean, some of it I said before. You know, particularly people that are more on the periphery, you've got to almost make more effort to kind of bring them, you know, closer to the core without disrupting, I suppose, you know, the adjustments or the ways of working that they've got, because they're not always going to be, which is, you know, perhaps wrong, but they're not always embedded enough or have enough one-on-one time to have access. And I think, you know, inclusion comes into the mix here as well, because participation, access to senior leadership, all those kinds of things tend to blur, don't they, when people have different working patterns, and it's really difficult. I mean, you know, thinking back to when I was in an equal pay worker owned co-op, so everybody in that 400 and plus staff was paid the exact same wage, no matter how long you'd been there. And when we dug into inclusion, we still found it's just not just about pay, or just not about showing up. There's so many things that impact, you know, as we know, people's working experience. So as much as we sometimes think in the charity sector, it's pay that's impacting our staff, because we can't pay as much as other industries, it's not always the case. You know, there's a lot more that we can do. So yeah, if I suppose if the culture is only functioning for those people in the building, you know, 5 days a week, then it's probably not really working for everybody, is it? And I think I think it's embedding that. So, and again, it's the leaders that have to kind of work from the front. So I think it requires thinking about, where does culture actually reach them, and you know, we're doing a bit of work at the moment in terms of, we do a lot of insight for students, and you know, we've started to have conversations about what insight looks like for staff as well. in terms of staff personas, because, you know, somebody who's working the night shift on the night bus on a Saturday is very different to somebody who's in, I don't know, anywhere else, for example. And we've got a whole range of that. So what are the ways, how do we segment that audience, and then how do we reach them? You know, because everybody's got a unique way that they want to be reached, and that, you know, it comes from making sure your systems are aligned so that everyone's got one system that, you know, there's so many ways of like slicing it, I suppose. But some people, you know, we recently stopped doing, for example, something called the weekly news, which we used to write from the people and culture team, and it used to go out every Monday. And then we've changed IT systems, uncoupled from the university, and we've somewhere along the line made the assumption that everyone will see everything on Viva Engage. Very quickly learned that no, they absolutely won't see that. And I check payroll, you know, every week and every month, so I know who's starting and leaving. But it wasn't until I was having these sort of manager clinics that we've started doing, where we talk about their data, that people were saying, oh, well, I really miss seeing who the new starters are and who the leavers are, because that really impacts. And so it's like, I've not realised that because it doesn't affect me. But so it's understanding what the needs are of every type of worker in your organisation, which once you've cracked it, I think is something you can apply across projects and across initiatives. So it's not just, you know, if you've got a new strategy, which we will do towards the end of the year, how are we reaching every single member of staff? So yeah, I'd say I'll keep rambling on because there's just so many different ways. So I'll be quiet now. But yeah, I think understanding who your people are and how best to reach them, making sure they all kind of get as much equitable access as possible.
Yeah, I really love that, and it's about making it meaningful and how it connects. I'm wondering, Sam and Andy, if there's anything you wanted to add.
I worked for a big membership organisation across the UK, and you know, who've gone through lots of different culture, you know, barriers, difficulties, you know, and one of the big culture programs that I led was after a period of crisis. And I think the thing that I learned the most about that is you have to have like culture carriers. You have to identify your hub of humans who are going to buy in, or not buy in, but do it quietly and do it with you and have really, you know, back and forth about what that looks like. And those people you have to trust to be able to lead the culture and be the culture when you aren't in the room or when anyone is in the room, really. And you'd hope that that's in your line managers or whatever, but it might not be. It might be in the person that greets people in the Wales office, or it might, you know, it might be the person that starts off the chat in the Teams call. Like, that's fine as well. And I think identifying those people and leading the culture through them, and particularly making sure that there aren't tiers of culture forming, is really important. And again, that comes within accountability and really having a laser focus of what those values are, how that's going to impact the culture and what they're buying into, and not making it too complex. Like, cut out all the crap that you can and just keep cracking on with that. And, you know, eventually you'll get there. And sometimes that might mean that people have to move on, and okay, that's okay too. Like, we have to be realistic. No one's going to have the happy workplace every day. So I think just staying laser focused, choosing your culture carriers, and making sure that you are working your hardest that tiered approach doesn't form, I think is the only thing you can do, really.
Yeah, I absolutely love that stuff about culture carriers and who are the people who are kind of your cabal of people who are going to help you drive this stuff through, and finding those really quickly. Because I think, you know, there are practical things that you can do about formal integration. Like, I don't want to be too bureaucratic because Tony put something about unbureaucraticness as a value in there, but there are things around, like, you know, you can formally integrate things into one-to-ones and appraisals, and, you know, get those opportunities for people to be seen living the values, but they can become quite bureaucratic quite quickly if it's not seen as an authentic process. And where culture really lives is in that regular contact between parties. I think I talk a lot whenever I'm doing things around. I always come back to the Johnson and Scholes culture web as the kind of model that I use a lot, and the things in there about the importance of stories, the importance of symbolic moments, rituals, and routines, and and being able to use those kind of keynote moments to kind of just do this constant filter. I said before about having this a monthly all staff meeting where we bring everybody together virtually and where we talk about different things. We do some celebration of activities that are going on. We do the starters and leavers stuff that Amrit was talking about in terms of being able to highlight that. One of the things that we put into that event, I used to work at Sheffield, and when I was doing that at Sheffield, I had a team join. The sports team joined our directorate from a different directorate. And after they'd been at the first of the meetings, I said to the director of sport, "How did you find that?" And they went, "Oh no, it was good. It was really good, but you used not a lot of acronyms." And and universities have a lot of acronyms, and for a lot of my staff, they didn't really understand what was going on. And so we went, right, tell you what we'll do. We'll do an acronym swear box. So now every meeting, everyone can take a list, and if I use an acronym, I get charged £1 up to a maximum £10 per meeting. And at the end of the year, I'll give all of that as a donation to the alumni collection fund. And it worked brilliantly because it was just a way of kind of a reminder of going, if we want everybody to understand what we're doing, then we can't use exclusive language. Actually, we need a mechanism for doing that, but we can do that in a fun and open way that demonstrates that we're able to make mistakes. And at the end of every meeting, you would see me kind of put my head in my hands when I realized I'd done 7 that I hadn't even noticed. And I just, and the same thing happened here at Kent when I started doing this. Someone went, "Oh, there's acronyms everywhere." I was like, "Right, I'm putting the acronym swear box back in," because it flew. And then what I had was some of the culture carriers, like Sam was talking about, were holding me accountable in the meeting, in the chat of the meeting, going, "There's one, Andy," and at the end of the thing, putting their hands up to go like, "Oh, you've done it again," and it was like it's become self-perpetuating. It's become that repeating pattern of going, "Yeah, we're spotting it," and now other people in other meetings are going, "Oh, that'll be a £5 in acronym bingo." It's like, well, we don't charge it in this meeting, but I'm good that you're seeing that actually in talking in that way, you're excluding people who don't understand what we're talking about. So it's those kind of things of like rituals and routines as well that you can put in.
I am a big fan of the cultural web model, and I felt my ADHD kicking in, Andy. So as soon as you said it, I was trying to look for a reputable source to share with our audience, which I will do at some point. Um, so my apologies if you're speaking and I'm looking off screen. I'm trying to help. Um, the one of the things that you've kind of mentioned both in this question but previously as well is like keeping it simple, and I remember seeing that the kind of jar approach. I think this was when I was a SAB a million years ago at Anglia Ruskin, and we'd had a new vice chancellor who got sick and tired of everybody all of the senior leadership team, all of the academics referring to the university, part of that culture of like blame and like the lack of accountability. And so, yeah, he implemented something similar, which was anybody that talked about the university rather than our university or us, had to kind of pop that in there. The other story that is more around the kind of simplicity aspect was when I'd worked at a college and I'm working with 16-year-olds. And I used to run a session that was to combat homophobia. And this was around the time where there was a certain term being used all of the time, like part of the kind of cultural vocabulary. And so whenever I'd kind of run these workshops with these teenagers, if I heard them use that in like the corridor, it was never like a challenge because we've had the conversation in the workshop, like we did the work, we did the understanding. So after that, it would just be me walking through the college going, no, whenever I heard that. And there was never kind of any follow-up. This like 10,000 students, so it was really hard to keep on top of. But yeah, I ended up becoming the nope lady, walking through the college campus. So there are lots of wonderful ways, but yeah, I love that kind of keeping it simple, keeping people accountable, particularly around the follow-up. This is an excellent opportunity for me to remind our wonderful audience that if you have any questions for our excellent panel, please do pop them in the Q&A or in the chat. I'll keep an eye on them. I am loving people's contributions in the chat so far, so do keep that coming. Whilst you're thinking, if the panelists are ready for your next question. We probably see this less in values-led organizations, we see it less within charity, but it is an example that I've kind of picked up, and because it happens less, we're not as prepared when it comes up. So what advice would you give for a situation where you have a member of staff, member of team, a colleague who are super high performing, so meeting all of the criteria, making a lot of impact, but are consistently undermining the organizational values? What kind of advice would you share?
Okay, I'll go.
Excellent, Annie. Same
We were in a
brain.
standoff then, weren't we, all of us? Like, who's going to go? See, I struggle with this because I think values are just as important as performance. For me, I put them on par. And we talk about personality hires, and sometimes those are important. Like you've got that, and the values hire, personality hire is something that can carry a team through sometimes. In this case, I think I would have a really honest conversation in the sense of your performance is great, but we can't keep winning in this way. And here's what the costs are. And this is why this isn't sustainable. And so I would rather you perform at 80% and work on those things than you let's go 60% even, and you work on that, then you continually keep performing. However, there being a cost to the wider team and how we do things, and my values even, like I think that's really important. So, and I think ultimately, if they were going to continue down the road of choosing not to align with the values, I think then a different conversation has to be had, because I just think you can teach so many skills, but I don't think you can teach values. And that for me, especially when most of us in this room will be working for charities, small charities, big charities, students' unions, and that will be really important for us, is making sure that we perform, but also balance that with the mission. And so I think it's hand in hand for me, but I am famously a little bit mean.
Well, no, I agree, Sam. I think the thing for me is how can you be high performing if operating in a way that undermines the values of the organization, and that sense of like, just because that person's doing well, what's the knock-on consequence for that? Because their individual performance might be creating a drag for the rest of the the rest of the organization. The amount of time you're having to then invest in dealing with the knock-on consequences of their behavior with the rest of the organization, actually their individual performance means that the overall performance of the organization is going down. I think there is a fundamental question that needs to be asked if you're in that situation, which is what's going on. Like how has a situation been allowed to develop where there is such a divergence between one person's individual behavior and the values that you want within an organization? And is that because you're trying to impose a new set of values that don't really fit with the culture that's there already? Classic culture definition being just the aggregation of the values, behaviors, and beliefs of everybody in the room. Like, is that what's going on? Is it like, actually, no, they've been around a while and they're sitting inside a group where this has already been allowed and you're now trying to steer the culture? Is it that you did something wrong in your recruitment practices and something is a failure in that's allowed someone to come in that way? I think, as Sam said, though, I really like the term, we can win, but not in this way, so how do we win in the right way? that we want. And I think being clear with people, it just being high performing isn't a get out of jail free card for doing all of the other things that you want, because ultimately if they're not willing to embody those values, you have to have an honest conversation with them about whether they're in the right organization before right organization or not. Amrit mentioned it before about this kind of kind of very clear and open conversations with people, about like, is this the right place for you? Even though, so you're great, but this might not be the place that actually where you're going to perform, because we're having to deal with it. And I think the other thing I would say around this as well is, I'm sure people have been in this situation before where they hope it's going to resolve and they don't grasp the nettle quickly enough. And my experience over the career that I've had is that you save a lot of time by having that honest conversation earlier on and looking to move the situation on, than just letting it stay and hoping that it'll change, because all that happens if you don't deal with it is it just starts to infect outwards. And depending on where they are, if we're in a thing, as we said before, about a distributed team where you're not seeing each other, before you know where you are, actually that could have snowballed further as well. So early intervention is the right thing to do.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think I always come back to the thing that it's like the behavior, the worst behavior that you tolerate, the lowest version of that becomes the culture you create. So it won't, if that's what you're accepting, your culture will always drop to that. Or if you're aspiring, there's a tipping point, isn't there? And I think where I've noticed it become a little bit different is where I think you're trying to shift the culture. I think Andy referenced this earlier, and it's not the common denominator at the moment, but so I think it's being clear about what it is that you're trying to achieve, because I think when you're trying to shift the culture, you have people who are trying to do that, and then there's resistance sometimes to that as well, and people think that that's poor behavior. So it's being really clear, actually, what are the key things that you are trying to shift that. What are the behaviors that do form the culture that you want, and those can be the ones that they aspire to. But I think the damage, like Andy and Sam both referenced there, it's quite wide, isn't it? And the psychological safety that you've got for staff, that I suppose they can remain quiet, but it signals something to them if you tolerate it, and it's usually impacting the people who are typically least powerful, I suppose, in whatever that means in today's world, in the workplace, because we do have those dynamics. But it is harder than it sounds. I think staff find, managers do find it difficult to have clear and difficult conversations, and I think it's easy, perhaps, in this room to sort of, because we have them all the time, every day, probably, but not everybody's doing that, and just letting people try it and giving them that leeway to train in it, but also try it and find their way of coming through that with whilst giving them the right parameters to operate in. But yeah, it does also require, and I think sometimes in charities and in our kind and compassionate world, it requires a risk appetite to take difficult decisions, and obviously that changes depending on the type of worker that you're dealing with, doesn't it? And all the things around that, because we have different types of workers, and the reputational damage and things like that we've got to consider. So yeah, there's a number of things. It's not as easy as it sounds to just exit somebody, is it? Not that I'm saying that that's what you should do, but in those instances where that's the only option, or dealing with bad behavior, or bad's not the right word, is it? But counterculture behavior is not always as easy as it sounds.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people really empathize with that situation. They're uncomfortable conversations because they're uncomfortable. I think, listening to the three of you and thinking about my experiences, it's kind of understanding the journey that they're on. And for those of you who don't know me, I have a coaching background. And so one of the things that we do within coaching is that we would recontract. And so, okay, well, we're going through this period of change, something's different. How are we going to work through this? And then that's when you introduce the kind of different levels of accountability and you move forward in good faith. And in most cases, you'll kind of see whether that changes. But actually, you know, in the question that I asked, when it's consistently undermining those values, then yeah, that's when the conversation might be different. But there are lots of steps and different types of interventions that you can take within that. And there's definitely a lot of support and expertise. I'm sure people are happy to kind of reach out and support one another. That's one of the things that's really incredible about our sector and our wonderful humans in this space. So thank you, everybody. Right, I'm just I haven't noticed anything else in the chat. And so please do pop anything in. I have one more question for the panel, if nothing else is coming in so far. So in a world that is going through lots of unprecedented change circumstances, as already mentioned, and knowing that there is big cultural divides, political diversity, all sorts of things going on, I'd love your take on what responsibility does an organisation have to extend its values beyond its organisation. So I'm thinking about, you know, suppliers, partners, the wider community. This might be where your kind of members or beneficiaries are placed. This might be universities for those of you that are in student unions. So yeah, I'd love your take on that.
I'm happy to jump in first on this. I mean, I think there's three. The answer is it depends, right? And there's three questions that I would ask people. So first of all, what's your mission? What's the mission of the organisation? Because if the mission is to influence outwards, then yes, it's very much kind of core to what you're trying to do and your values. But then you have to think about, well, what's your ability to apply influence within those spaces? What actual power do you have to be able to influence those parties? And if you don't have that ability, how much energy are you going to expend being unable to actually move that forward, and what's the cost to the organization in terms of where you could better put that energy? And I think, again, kind of, you know, how much does not expend, the third question, how much does not extending your values to those parties actually undermine you living your values as the organization? So kind of balancing those things out and thinking about those sort of factors would be my first sort of consideration for people in this area.
I'll come in on that. I don't think it's getting any easier, is it? I think that's the thing. And I think where we're placed is really unique. There's not, having worked in quite a few different types of workplaces, you know, it's rare that you encounter one that's like politically driven the way it is. You know, having a younger workforce that's more present in certainly, you know, social media platforms and things like that extend your reach, you know. So I think I mean, to my mind, it's a fine line to tread, depending, as Andy said, on, well, for me, like, you know, what your role is, because I think, you know, what my responsibility is in carrying that reputation is a bit different to somebody who might work part-time in the co-op, I would say, because, you know, I'm more visible naturally, and again, that extends to our student leaders as well. And I think that's a line that increasingly they find challenging to tread, because they are elected a lot of the time, you know, on the basis of, you know, their manifestos, their candidate statements. But yet when they come in to the environment, they're operating with really big, responsible, you know, things on their shoulders, like being a trustee, you know, of a really big students' union and things like that. So I think it you know, people talk, networks are visible, and obviously your behavior will reach things, places that you're not in, and it's how you communicate that and how you navigate that and how you set expectations in a way that feels democratic, I suppose, from their mind. But yet there are certain things that I would say, working in HR as well, that are probably non-negotiable as well. And my colleagues here might think a bit differently, but yeah, it's not to try and obviously own anybody's identity outside of work. That's certainly not what we're in the business of doing. But it's understanding what your responsibility is. As any individual, and what risk that sometimes carries, I think is important to understand. But ideally, if we've got everything right, as we've been talking about, all the way from end-to-end recruitment and the staff journey, I think that's something that you can kind of protect. But yeah, I see that coming up as a challenge more and more. So yeah, welcome any learning opportunities there.
I think as long as you are putting your values into things like your employer brand, your procurement processes, your questions you ask, and if you're a membership organisation, your values have to be visible outward, like you have to live them outwardly as well as inwardly. So I think as long as you are doing those things, you will always, well, you would hope that you make the decision that is based on your values, and you get partners and suppliers and stuff that work within them. But yeah, everything that everyone else said.
Amazing, thank you. We have 4 more minutes left, and we've had a couple of questions come in from the Q&A. And so, yeah, just kind of quick thoughts from Rachel's question. How do you ensure culture is truly about values that benefit the organisation and not just how managers like things to be done?
I guess somebody has to choose what those values are, and somebody that aren't the managers that just like to be done in a certain way. I also don't think that values are necessarily how you do things. Like, I think that values should be aspirational, they should be outward facing, they should be in the activity that you do. It's not, and they of course translate to behaviours, but I don't think both of those are the same thing. So if they are, maybe that's the thing you need to look at.
And following off, I think it's that co-creation bit that we talked about earlier on, of like, how does it feel old? I mean, ultimately, if you don't espouse values, they will appear, because they will be the ways that people will behave, and this is where you get that conflict. So being really open about where you are and where you want to go, I think is the crucial part. And if you think that managers are just saying, I like it to be done in this way, how does that play with the actual values of the organization? If you're the one saying it's different, well, how does your value set sit with where things are going to be? I think it comes into those honest conversations again, which I'll link to question 2, but we'll come to that in a second. Amrit?
Yeah, I'm just puzzling that one out. I think, yeah, reflecting on what you're saying. I think it, like Sam said, they're not always present, are they, in absolutely how you do everything, because that would be a bit difficult. But I think it is the lens through which staff will question what you're doing and why, because they will say, well, is this inclusive, or is this open, is this transparent? But there are degrees of transparency out there, and there's degrees of, there are some decisions that have to be made in a room that isn't accessible, transparent to everybody. And I think that's being able to, I think if you can explain how you're doing things or your why for doing things, increasingly staff are wanting to understand the decision making behind how you're doing stuff. And it's being frank, it's being, human in how you're having those conversations, and sort of saying, well, look, this is as much as I can describe it to you, and this is the reasoning. And it's building that trusting relationship, isn't it? Because I think you can explain till the cows come home, but if you haven't got that foundation of trust in leadership or management, then that's something perhaps different that needs addressing. But again, there's a limit. I think there's boundaries to what people can expect.
Thank you, everyone. If anybody needs to dash off, we won't be offended. But panel members, are you okay to take one more question? Real quick? Yeah. So Annie's question, you've all shared about modelling the culture outwards and downwards, but what happens when the CEO is championing a culture of honest conversation, but isn't modelling it themselves? So the question is, how do you create change upwards?
So Amrit mentioned radical candor, earlier on. And I think it's that I've always talked about, like, if I have crumbs in my beard from eating a sausage roll, I'd like someone to tell me, because it's an act of care. Yes, it's embarrassing, but I need someone to tell me that it's done. And if you're there and you can see that your leader isn't living the values that they're trying to espouse, being able to say, I need to tell you that you're saying this thing, but you're not living it, and I'm doing that not because I want to criticize you, but because I care about you and I want us to be successful. I want this organization to be successful, but you're not demonstrating the things that we have. That's the way to do it. It does link though with what Amrit was just saying there though about trust and that sense of safety to be able to have that conversation as well. And if people don't feel that they have that underlying trust, that's a much harder conversation to be able to have. But so long as you're being clear that I'm not saying this just to be a dick, I'm saying this because I care about you and because I want us to be successful, and therefore I need to tell you X. And hopefully the leader will then say, thank you very much. Yes, that's quite hard to hear, but I will take that on and I'll do something about it. What they won't do is go, how dare you say this? This is outrageous.
Yeah.
Go on, you go, Amrit.
Okay. Yeah, I think that sounds challenging. I think it's as well giving staff, just off the back of what Andy said, opportunities to share feedback. And I think that, that comes through pulse surveys, doesn't it? Engagement surveys. It might come from third party kind of, how are we measuring our culture? What are the kind of deliverables on that? And giving people the opportunity to give feedback anonymously, I suppose, and instances of that. I think the difficult thing about leadership is that honesty, obviously, we'd all aspire to be honest, but I think when as a leader, you have to make decisions that aren't always well received and aren't always well liked. And I think sometimes, people do conflate that. Well, I don't like what you've decided, therefore I don't trust you and I don't think you're honest. And I think it's being able to parse that out from what is actually real dishonesty, I think is challenging, because you are going to be the one that is taking difficult decisions on the people around you. So yeah, but I suppose in a world where that's actually happening and you've got something challenging there to deal with, I think it's measuring your culture and giving people that opportunity to feed back on it, so that if there are trends and it's not just anecdotal, then you can present that in a way that doesn't feel always personal, and you can voice it in a way that doesn't have that. Or there might be people that are trusted that are in a higher position that should be safe to disclose that to, that then can go have that one-on-one conversation. But again, it takes time, doesn't it, and consistency. Yeah.
I have done this in the past, many times. So I have a practical tip. One of my practical tips is to find a co-conspirator. So somebody else within your leadership group that will back you in every meeting where you're going to talk about something that's a bit challenging. And that's normally because your values align, you vibe, that sort of thing. Find that person whenever you two speak, and it might not be very often that you have to, lay the cards down, but when it happens, there's something in it. So there's that. The other one is write it all down in a really kind email 2 days before a one-to-one and say, I need to talk to you about these things. I'm doing this with care, but I want you to have time to self-reflect and do the process that you need to do. It's with love. Here's my feedback. That has worked every single time for me. And it just means that no one is having to react in the space, which I think is very helpful.
And what a wonderful way to end our webinar. Thank you so much for your extra time, panelists, and for those of you who are watching this. I hope you found it helpful and insightful, and I have loved every moment of it. So thank you so much, everybody. I hope you have an excellent rest of your week. And if there's anything that we've spoken about today that you want to just throw some ideas out, please do feel free to get in touch with us. But otherwise, I will leave you to your afternoons. Thank you, everybody, so much. And thank you so much, Andy, Amrit, and Sam. Thank you.
No problem. Take care, everyone. Bye.